Karen Reed was arraigned in court a few days after the death of John O'Keefe, charged with manslaughter, leaving the scene of a motor vehicle collision causing death, and motor vehicle homicide. Her lawyer, David Yannetti, told the press that it had been an accident, that Karen had not intentionally hit John. That was in February of 2022. But by April of 2023, this past year, Karen's story had changed from it was an accident to he was murdered inside the house. How the story changed is fascinating. The pieces are still falling into place, but more is being learned every week. If you've been following this channel all summer, you've had a front row seat because at one point we were an unwitting part of that strategy. We were actually seemingly targeted by the defense in order to smear an innocent young man with a false story, all with the purpose of creating reasonable doubt. You have to ask yourself, if you were in Karen's situation facing lengthy prison time, how far would you go? Creating doubt about the police and the prosecutors seems maybe like fair game. But would you be willing to smear someone innocent just to create an alternative killing theory? First, a word on my analysis. It comes from me. I'll talk to anyone on any side, gather information, listen to arguments. The last time I spoke to Aiden on the phone, we talked an hour, and I like talking to him because I always enjoy talking to intelligent people. We already know his arguments in the Karen Reed case, but in talking to him and in asking questions, I was able to get to what his main arguments were, why he believes so strongly. Does any of that influence me? Of course, it should. You listen to the arguments and then you factor it in with your thinking. I've also talked to Kate Peter. As with Aiden, I argued with her, challenged her theories. Her theory about how John was struck by the SUV is completely different than mine. Many of you have seen my theory on John's injuries, and I can tell you when the idea hit me, I was bending down to let the dog out of the crate. John's head wound, combined with the lack of injury to his back or shoulders, had bothered me all summer. The solution hit me in a flash of insight. It might, of course, be completely wrong, but it's my theory. No one else suggested any part of it, and though subsequent evidence from the vehicle data seems to support that theory, as far as I know, I'm the only one who believes it. Kate believes John was knocked into the fire hydrant or maybe a nearby electric box. This obsession by those in the Free Karen Reed movement about who I talk to is, well, weird. As a matter of fact, I was just talking about this with Brian Albert this morning while we were doing yoga. You guys, I don't know. I've never communicated with any of the Alberts. My first communication with anyone on the other side was a little over a month ago when Kate reached out to me after I had confronted Aiden on my show. But I would have talked to her before that if she had reached out. I'll talk to any intelligent person. Unfortunately, all summer, as I covered this, my only options were to talk to people from one side. The only information I got was from one side. I was totally aware of this problem and bothered by it. I even reached out to Jen McCabe back in May. She, of course, ignored my request to do an interview. I want information from both sides. Don't you? The job of a journalist, fuck that, the job of a citizen is to get information from both sides and weigh things. That's what I've done since the beginning, as best I could. Mistakes were made. You acknowledge them, learn from them, move on. And learning is the process that has to continue here. When this is all over, a lot of people are going to be left with that icky feeling of having been manipulated. But don't feel gaslighted. Approach it intellectually. Stand back and say, what can we learn from this? There was no feud between John O'Keefe and Colin Albert. Ever. It's complete fiction. You'll know this by the end of the trial, if not sooner, but it's fascinating to see how this smear evolved. When Karen called Jen McCabe about 4:45 that morning looking for John, do you know who McCabe first called herself when she hung up? Julie Albert, Chris's wife, because Chris Albert's family no longer lived near John. They'd moved close to downtown earlier in the month. She thought maybe John crashed there. An understandable thought, as you'll see. On the last day of John's life, earlier that afternoon, he went into D&E Pizza with his nephew. D&E is owned by Chris Albert. Chris and John talked about meeting up later at the waterfall. In fact, that night, it was Chris who texted John to meet them at the waterfall. Odd behavior if there was a feud between Colin and John, isn't it? So where did the idea of a feud between Colin and John begin? How did Karen go from "I didn't know I hit him" to "I saw John go inside the house and they killed him there"? In the days after Karen was charged, her lawyer, David Yannetti, received a tip from private investigator Steve Scanlon, who had heard that John was killed inside the house. For a brief time, a recorded phone call between Scanlon and Turloy was available online. In that interview, Scanlon essentially said he had no evidence, but he just didn't believe John was killed in a hit and run. He believed it happened inside the house. Now, it's possible he actually had evidence and just wouldn't admit it, but more than likely, he picked up a rumor and went to Yannetti, perhaps looking to get hired as an investigator. When I heard the call, I thought Scanlon sounded sincere, he sounded honest, but he also struck me as someone who just wanted to insert himself into the case. And people like this come out of the woodwork all the time, something Aiden knows better than anyone. As an example, my team had someone trying to tell us earlier this summer about a secret call from Brian Higgins to his old girlfriend, essentially confessing to being there for the murder. So it goes with the territory. You have to learn how to dismiss the nonsense. Aiden clearly didn't believe Scanlon had anything significant. Aiden has developed good instincts about who has real information and who's just trying to be a part of things. I also talked to someone from Canton this summer whose son knows all the people involved, and the son had also picked up a rumor that something had happened inside the house. That's how rumors work. They can be based on something true or something not true. You should see some of the rumors I've heard about myself in recent weeks. But Yannetti didn't care whether this was rumor or not because it was useful. Yannetti hired a private eye. I guess for some reason he didn't hire Scanlon himself. PI found a neighbor named Tom Beatty, who was a friend of Karen's and of John's, and he said Colin was at 34 Fairview that night. He knew this because his daughter was a friend of Colin's. Well, how did this tidbit become the aha thing it's become? That Colin was at the party was expected. Before the after-hours party had been a birthday party for 23-year-old Brian Albert Jr., so of course, Colin was there. We don't know just what Tom Beatty said and how he said it. Was he suspicious of Colin? Or did he just matter-of-factly explain to the PI that Colin had been at the birthday party? You have to remember how a defense team operates. They're seeking all the information they can and hoping to find enough little odd pieces to stitch together a plausible alternative theory. At some point, with the PI's work in hand and the reports compiled by police for the grand jury, Yannetti noticed that Colin Albert's name was not included as being inside the house when he spoke to Canton Police Detective Lang. And boom, the Colin theory began to take shape. We can debate whether Brian Albert lied to Detective Lang. From Brian's point of view, Colin simply wasn't there. Colin had been at Brian Albert Jr.'s birthday party, but not at the after-hours party. Brian saw him leaving just as he was arriving. The birthday party and the after-hours party were separate events. Maybe Brian was protecting his nephew by leaving him off the list, or maybe he just didn't consider it relevant. He wasn't inside the house for the after-hours. However, here was something the defense could exploit. But what the defense needed next was a motive. Why would Colin Albert ever start a fight with John O'Keefe, a friend of his father's? The guy his father had invited out for drinks that night. A Boston cop who stood 6'2", friend of his Uncle Kevin's, a Canton cop, someone who worked with his Uncle Brian, a Boston cop. But 18-year-old Colin actually started a fight with John O'Keefe. If the defense was going to create a plausible alternative, accusing 18-year-old Colin of attacking John as soon as he walked to the house, they needed a motive. And only one person could help create this: Karen. Karen recently told Gretchen Voss of Boston Magazine of a night during the spring of 2020 when O'Keefe's home security alarm went off and he bolted out of bed. She followed him down the stairs, and she says she remembers seeing Colin and several teens in the front yard. "Go fuck yourself," she remembers Colin yelling. "Get the fuck out of here," John replied. The next morning, Karen says the couple woke to a dozen empty Bud Light cans strewn in the bushes. Police were never called, but from then on, she says there was bad blood between Colin and O'Keefe. This story is fiction. However, the best lies include kernels of truth. There is a Ring video of this confrontation on the lawn. My understanding is it still exists, but it won't be the defense showing it in court, because Colin Albert is not in the video. Gretchen investigated this and confirmed it was other teens. Are you seeing the steps along the path to a smear? Yet Eddie hears John died inside the house. His PI learns Colin was in the house at some point. Colin is not listed originally as being there. Then a real incident involving teens drinking on the lawn is borrowed by Karen in order to create a lie. Do you actually think Colin, an 18-year-old kid, is going to drink on the lawn of a Boston cop who works with his uncle, who's friendly with his other uncle, a Canton cop, and who's friendly with his own dad, the same dad who would invite John to the waterfall that night? It's like in My Cousin Vinny, you can't pull the wool over our eyes forever. Well, not all of us. But if you're not fully convinced, I can give you more, and this includes a first-hand account. I was told this summer by a former federal law enforcement official who had sources in Canton, including, he said, inside the Canton police, that John O'Keefe had called the police to report Colin was dealing drugs in the neighborhood. That information proved to be wrong, and I'm ashamed of the role I played in it. Never mentioned Colin's name. I felt a real hesitation to smear a young man, a hesitation I wish other journalists shared, but I did say the nephew. Look, I've been hearing from multiple sources all summer about a feud between John and Colin, and many of these sources were actually in law enforcement. I didn't report this stuff because I considered it rumor. This is why you have to be careful. False rumors spread through cops just like anyone, but we now know there was actually an organized campaign to spread this false tale. I've seen it in action. However, my source this summer claimed he had sources inside the building when the call actually came in. That struck me as credible enough to report. But the story was not true. Chief Rafferty came out and confirmed John did call the police on a young drug dealer in the neighborhood, but it was not Colin. My source then backtracked, but only a little, telling me the drug dealer worked for Colin, or at least with him. There's no evidence for that, and it's almost certainly not true. More likely, it reflects the need to double down on false information. We're going to see a lot of that in this case now. But the question is, what was the ultimate source of the false information on the drug dealing smear? I don't know. But it sure looks familiar to the story of the kids drinking on the lawn, doesn't it? A real event, John calling the cops on a drug dealer, is co-opted for the purpose of smearing someone innocent. Also a plausible alternative killing theory can be built. Yikes. I can also tell you, with inside knowledge, that Karen herself has been running a behind-the-scenes information campaign all along. She reaches out directly to anyone in social media who has taken up her cause. She uses an app called Signal in order to leave no trace. And among the people she'd been reaching out to, unknown to me at the time, was my source on the drug dealing story. And not only to him, but to his sources, who were retired officials in the Canton police. And that's how the drug dealing smear was built. In July, on Dateline, Karen's attorney, Alan Jackson, said this.
Alan Jackson, Karen's high-profile attorney, believes John was set up that night.
John walked into an element of hostility in that house.
So he suggests John was going into a hostile environment. This was exactly at the same time that the smear about Colin's drug dealing was being spread. A surveillance video from the waterfall was released, and now the usual suspects in this case were watching Brian Albert and ATF agent Brian Higgins seemingly conspiring when John left to go to the bathroom. So now they were floating the theory that John walked into an ambush. Alan Jackson seems to have been in on this fiction. John, they said, was not going to an after hours to continue drinking. He was going into the house to settle a dispute with the Albert crime family. That's how it was being presented to me. The Alberts are the Corleones of Canton. Proctor answered to them, Chief Berkowitz, Detective Lang, Morrissey, Lally. Everyone knew Brian Albert was the man behind the curtain. And John went to the house for a kind of sit-down. And as any mafioso knows, when you get called to a sit-down, you might not come out alive. All of this is going to be studied in law schools and journalism colleges. The strategy of constructing this smear was not brilliant, but it was clever and well played. But it's not brilliance that's required to make this work. It's an utter lack of conscience.